Hey there. Hey there, how are you doing? Hey everyone, welcome back to another webinar by PyNet Labs Private Limited. In this webinar, we're going to talk about different network automation protocols which are available and what all are the tools that are used into industry, as well as some of the dominating technologies which are being used for automating the network. So without wasting much of the time, we will get started with it and we will see how we can work with it, for which I'll use some of my whiteboards to explain different tools which are available. So when we talk about network automation tools, when we talk about dominant networking tools which are available, or we can also call it as network automation protocols, then there are some of the network automation protocols which are used normally, and these protocols are: number one, we talk about REST API too much. We talk about protocols like RESTconf too much. We also talk about protocols like netconf. Then we have remote management protocols. Now these three you can see are core automation protocols which are being used, but there are other automation protocols also, or there are other ways you can say that are implemented or that are used in order to achieve automation. For example, we still use SSH as our major client, as our remote management protocol whenever it comes to configuring devices, and then we also use things like telnet, which is another remote management protocol that we use in order to make communication possible from one point to the other point. Generally, the motive is to be able to automate and push configuration or fetch configuration from devices, or that can also be your, you can say, network infrastructure we're talking about. So when we have network infrastructure in a way that you have an admin PC, and that particular PC is connected to, let's say, a router. Now when we talk about this particular router, one thing is we are basically using a management interface. Let's say gig 0/0 is an interface that is being used, and in that gig 0/0 interface, this interface is going to play the role of management interface. So one interface of that particular device is blocked. You can say that you cannot really use that interface for your data plane. Let's say there are other devices which are being connected into the fabric. For example, you have R2, which again, let's say, is a router. Then we have R3. So when R1, R2, R3 are connected in this way, they also might be using maybe an automation way or maybe a routing way where all of them wants to get connected into an autonomous system. For example, let's say they are using OSPF area 0. Now it is possible that one of that particular router has a loopback which is created, the other two has physical interfaces or physical LANs associated with it, and third router has nothing on the LAN side, but it should be able to communicate with the LAN segments and the loopback segments that are available onto the other two routers. So in such kind of cases, we would expect the configuration to be done into an automative way, where you might create a Python script onto this PC, and this Python script should be able to reach out to all routers. Second thing is, all routers must be configured using the Python script, and you can say domain specific communication must be established, which means when we're talking about networks on the back end, when we're talking about R1 having its LAN segment, R2 having its LAN segment, right, R3 having its LAN segment, the communication between these networks should be enabled, right? And for enabling that, you must have your OSPF or your routing domain configured in a proper way. And that's the goal of our Python script. When you are going to create a Python script, my Python script is going to focus in a way that this PC should be able to go on R1, it should be able to go on R2, it should be able to go on R3, and then put out configuration onto each individual devices, where the configuration is not going to be similar. The configuration is definitely going to be different, right? The IP addresses that we might end up configuring onto these interfaces are different than the IP address that we might end up configuring on R2 and on R3. That's why dynamic data needs to be supplied into Python script. But number one thing, which is kind of a prerequisite in order to make this possible, is when R1 is being talked about, R1 needs to you can say push out PC needs to push out configuration on R1, and while we are configuring R1, user must supply inputs that what are the IP addresses and other parameters that needs to be configured onto R1. When we are done configuring R1, then your Python script would automatically go to R2, and then user inputs must be given while configuring R2, that what all are the IP addresses and the interfaces or the OSPF parameters that needs to be configured. And similarly, R3 also needs to be configured in this way. So in such kind of scenario, when we talk about configuration that are actually happening, when we talk about configuration that is being pushed out, you can either use the basic protocols which are available in order to ensure reachability. Now in that case, again, an interface from R2 will be dedicated to PC's connectivity, an interface from R3 will also be dedicated to the PC's connectivity. And when these PC's connectivity are ensured, one of the interface of R2, one of the interface of R1, and one of the interface of R3 are being reserved for the management access, right? And your data plane interfaces are then only these, and these. So in such cases, such communications are going to be made possible, and they must be configured by either using SSH or Telnet. So in your Python script, you will specify that either by using SSH or by using Telnet, you want to make reachability to R1, R2 and R3 possible, and once the Telnet or SSH session is established, then you want to push configuration onto either of these particular devices. That's how, by using basic automation protocols, you can push configurations onto the devices. Now the thing comes up then that how or when do we actually use advanced protocols? When do we use things like REST API? When do we use RESTconf? When do we use netconf? So when we talk about advanced devices, if I get rid of this stuff, let's say that I am going on to I'm using a particular PC, and that particular PC is my admin PC. Then I have an infrastructure where I have an advanced device like CSR 1000V. Now this CSR 1000V is also a router, and it is majorly an iOS XE based router. So iOS XE based routers, or it can be an NX OS based switch, or it can be an iOS XR based router. All of these platforms are Cisco's advanced platforms for enabling enterprises, data centers, and service provider networks to be able to push configuration or to be able to handle routings and processings of routes in a greater scale possible, right? Your normal iOS devices would not really be able to process the routing information as fast as these devices can, or even the switching capabilities or so. So the data also that is available onto these devices are of greater capabilities, are of greater importance, right? So when by using SSH and by using Telnet, if you are trying to do something like I want an output of show IP interface brief, right, the output will be given to you in the CLI waveform, right, in the CLI manner, in which you will get a table that will be the name of the interface, then you will have an IP address of the interface, then you will have a state of the interface and layer 3 information. The interface, let's say, is gig 0/0, the IP address is 1.1, state is up, layer 3 is up. The interface is gig 0/1, the IP address is not configured, state is down, layer 3 is also down. Now in such cases, when you expect your admin PC to be able to take decisions in a way that you have now a policy that is being pushed out, and that policy says that whatever interfaces onto such routers are up for more than 24 hours, right, and there is no IP address configured, you need to turn those particular interfaces off. In order to achieve such tasks, your PC must be able to identify or must be able to read the data that is being given out by the CSR 1000. And if we use standard protocols like SSH and Telnet, your PC won't really be able to consume the CLI outputs, because and even if it does so, you will have to write down such a complex script for every single application or so, because whenever CSR 1000V or whenever our routers or switches are giving you information out, that information is not according to a structured language, or that information is not something that a normal PC can consume. It is written into CLI, and CLI language outputs are supposed to be understood by network devices or network engineers. Normal human being won't really be able to consume that data, and so these PCs will also not be, or your management PC, whatever the devices are. That's why these protocol comes into picture. So when we talk about REST API, REST-conf and NetConf, they take help of something called data structuring languages. And the data structuring languages are XML, JSON or YAML. When we use XML, JSON or YAML, we are basically improving the way of how these particular data are going to be used. Let's say we have a very normal set of data. For example, it's an information about one of the employees that's working in a company. Let's say we have an employee. Under employee, number one characteristics of that employee is name. Okay, let's say name is Gary. Second information is going to be about the location. Let's say Gary's location is London, UK. Third information will be about the organization. Let's say organization is CISCO. Fourth information will be about role. Let's say role is network engineer, for example, right? And fifth information will be of domain. Let's say domain is data center. Now this information looks very well when we talk about humanized, when we talk about a human that is reading this information. but the information doesn't really scale well when we're talking about a PC to understand. So data like this needs to be structured for a human to understand. And to do that, there are data structuring languages which are used. So when same information is going to be written for a human to understand, that information in XML is going to look something like this, where a tag will be created which will be employee. Inside employee there will be name tag, and we will write down the value, and we will close the name tag, because XML is a language that works heavily, or that gives emphasis onto tags heavily. So we use tags there. Name tag is going to be used. Then we will use another tag that is going to be location, and I will say location is going to be filled in as London, UK, and then we will close down location. After that, we will create another tag that is going to be organization. I will fill in the information as CISCO, and I will close organization. Similarly, I will use another tag for role, and a role is going to be network engineer, and I will close down a role also. And then lastly, we're going to have domain, that's going to be data center, and domain will also be closed. And similarly, the employee tag will also be closed. So this is how same data can be converted into a language that can be understood by a PC. Likewise, whenever your CSR router is giving you information out, that particular CSR router is going to give you data into CLI language if you use protocols like SSH and Telnet. But if you want to digest information by the PC, so that PC can actually trigger actions based on the events that are happening, then you need to have this particular data understood. That's why device must create data in a structured way, either by using XML or by using JSON or by using YAML. So in order to do so, when we use netconf uses data structuring language as XML. RESTconf and REST API, both of them gives you the ability to use JSON and XML both as their data structuring language. Now where does JSON comes into picture? So netconf, when it came out, netconf was basically proposed into 2003, I believe. And at that time, XML was a very popular language that was being used for data structuring and assignments like that. So that's why when we work with netconf, we are given an option to create our payloads, our configuration, our piece of interface configuration, OSPF configuration. All of such configurations must be written by using XML as our tool of data structuring language. We cannot use JSON also. But XML was kind of hard language for humans to read. For example, if you look at a data which is at this side, this is more readable than the data that is written into XML. However, both the data are same. But likewise, if you talk about data that is written into JSON, JSON's data look much easier to read than XML. When we talk about JSON data, then you simply create a dictionary, you specify your employee there, and the value is going to be another dictionary. Inside of that, then you specify first value as your name, or first key as your name, and the value to that is going to be Gary, again enclosed into quotes. Then comma, you can specify second value, that's going to be location, and the value can be London. Then give a comma, specify third value as organization, and that's going to be CISCO. Give a comma, specify fourth key value pair, that is going to be role, and the value is going to be network engineer. the fifth value would be domain, or the fifth key will be domain, and the value to that will be data center. And then you can basically done, you can close that information and close that. So this is how your data would look like when you're talking about XML to JSON comparison. So when JSON came out into picture, JSON predominantly won over the way of how the data is written into JSON into XML, right? XML lost to JSON because humans and machines could read information when that was written into JSON more easily, and so because of its syntax, because of its simplicity, because of its lesser need of using tags and such kind of unnecessary things. Okay, the PCs were able to process the data faster, the humans were able to read data faster. That's why JSON was started to be replaced with XML, or XML was started to be replaced by JSON into more of the applications that were being used. So in such cases, REST API, REST-conf and NetConf, these three are protocols that are used, and XML, JSON, these two are more of the you can say more of the data structuring languages which are used in order to push or pull configurations from the device. Now when we talk about by using either of the mediums, what all are the tools that we need to have installed into your admin PC? When we talk about this management PC, that might be connected to either a single router, or it can be connected to multiple routers or multiple switches, right, or firewalls or whatever there is. What tools do we need to have installed onto this machine in order to be able to push configuration onto devices or fetch configuration onto devices? For basic application, okay, for basic application, when we talk about tools to be available on admin PC is, number one, you need to have Python installed. Number two, you need to have an IDE installed, which stands for Integrated Development Environment, right? And there are lots of options which are available. For example, you can have something like PyCharm, you can have something like VS Code, you can have things like Atom, you can have Eclipse, right? You can have Sublime Text. There are lots and lots of options which are available to be used when it comes to choosing what IDE to use, right? IDEs are basically used in order to write Python scripts. By using IDEs, you can debug your Python scripts, you can use your Python scripts right away from there. Okay. After that, you need extensions to be installed, and extensions like XML, extensions like JSON, extensions like SSH, extensions like Telnet. All of these particular extensions must be installed inside IDE so that your IDE can actually go out onto the device and create raw SSH sessions, create raw HTTP sessions with those particular devices, and can process XML or JSON data very easily. There are also third-party libraries which comes up into play when we talk about creating connection, when we talk about creating communication by using IDE and so on. So these are basic tools what are used in order to making automation possible by using either REST API, REST-conf, NetConf, or by using normal SSH or Telnet. Now, dominantly there is other tools, or there is one very popular tool which is getting famous, and the name of that particular tool is Ansible. Almost everyone is talking about Ansible. Almost everyone wants to implement Ansible and learn Ansible and see how that particular Ansible works and so. So in such cases, what Ansible is and where does Ansible comes from, and how can it be compared with the other methods of configuration that is being pushed? Generally, when we talk about Ansible, Ansible is used in various domains. Ansible is not only created for network automation, it is also not only created for pushing configurations onto network devices. Ansible has been existing for a good amount of time now, but its ability to be used into network automation have just started to grow. So number one thing is Ansible basically can be used for doing network automation. And the biggest thing is, like REST API, RESTconf and NetConf has the limitation that it exposes a way of how your device or how your management device can understand whatever data is being returned out by the network device to you. Your PC, whenever it's being used, for example, if I take one PC here and that particular PC gets connected with a router, if I try to fetch some information out, then my PC won't understand it until unless the data is using structured language in order to showcase the output. Or my data will not completely be pushed in an automated way until unless I am pushing the configuration by writing the configuration into XML or JSON. That's one requirement that REST API, RESTconf and NetConf has or possesses of. And these particular protocols can only be configured onto platforms like iOS XE, iOS XR and NXOS, or it can be configured onto GUI enabled devices or GUI enabled controllers, you can say. For example, ASA uses ASDM, Application Security Device Manager, or you can say SD-WAN uses a controller called vManage that gives you a GUI dashboard. SD-Access uses something called DNA, Digital Network Architecture, right? Or ACI uses EPIC. All of these are GUI configurations or GUI accessibilities to manage the entire infrastructure. So REST API works very well with this GUI application, and RESTconf and NetConf works very well with platforms like XE, platforms like Nexus and platforms like XR. But Ansible, when it comes into picture, Ansible do not have such limitation. Ansible can be enabled onto all iOS devices, be it router, be it switch, right? And Ansible can also be used against devices like XR, it can be used against devices like Nexus, it can be used against devices like XE, and it can also be used against devices which exposes GUI abilities. So Ansible is something that does not need to be installed onto these or configured onto these devices. Ansible needs to be configured onto the management PCs. And that's where the requirement is that these management PC must be created of Linux environment, or rather Unix environment. So Linux and Mac operating systems works very well with Ansible, but Ansible has a limitation on Windows, that on Windows Ansible cannot really work well. Still, I have heard that there are discussions or developments going on which will enable Ansible to be installed onto Windows machines, right? But natively Ansible works fine when it is installed onto Unix environment, where we can use Linux, where you can use Mac OS operating systems in order to use them. So your device, your end device, your network infrastructure just should have something you can say SSH to be enabled, because Ansible uses transport protocol as SSH, and the data structuring language that it uses is something called YAML. So YAML is another data structuring language that has been introduced with Ansible, and guess what, it even gives you the flexibility and ability to use structured data in a very easier way possible. So just right away we talked about how XML is used for normal data. We saw that in XML we can write down information in this way, that an employee can be there, then we can specify the name of the employee by creating a tab, like let's say Abhijit is the name of the employee. I close the tag, then I create another tag like organization, and then I specify PyNet as my organization. Then I say that role, I specify instructor as my role, and then I close role tag. Then I specify domain, and I write down my domain as CISCO, and I close the domain tag, right? And I can also specify courses, and inside courses I can create more child to there. So I can say course 1 is CCNA, and I can close my C1. Then I can create C2 and say CCNP, and then I can specify that C2 there, and then I can you can say close my courses, and I can close my employee in this way. So this is how data can be written into XML. Now if I try to write down the same data into JSON, it will become a bit easier, right? Where I just need to create something like employee there, then I will specify my name as AB, then I will specify my organization as PyNet, then I specify my role as instructor, and I specify domain as CISCO, and then I say my courses now have another things. So I create another dictionary there. I specify my course 1 is CCNA, and I then say my course 2 is CCNP. Then I close my courses dictionary, I close my employee dictionary this way. This is how data can be written in an easier way possible. But YAML more simplifies the data. When you look at YAML, you just need to start your YAML file by using 3 hyphens, and after that 3 hyphens you can specifically write down that your employee, you're writing down the employee for the details, and inside of that you're going to have details where you would say name is Abhijit. Then you will come to the next line, you will specify organization is PyNet, then you will specify a role is instructor, you will specify domain is going to be CISCO, and then you have courses there. Because you have multiple values in courses, you will just create hyphens there. You will say CCNA is one course and CCNP is another course. Once you're done, use triple period sign to close the file. Now compare these languages. When you look at these, You see, XML is toughest, JSON is an intermediate language or a medium readability language, and YAML is the easiest way of writing down information in a structured way possible. That's why this is the fastest way, or the YAML is the easiest way to learn how data structuring can be done. And when you learn about that data structuring, you are going to write down this YAML configuration into your PC, into your Ansible playbook, and you're going to run the Ansible against the router or against the device that you have, and your device will be configured in that particular way. So Ansible contains of multiple playbooks. Okay, like I said, Ansible uses playbook which has collection of plays, or you can also call them as tasks, and every task basically needs to be executed, whatever is specified into that Ansible playbook. And this Ansible playbook is written into YAML language. That's why it again becomes more easier to write down tasks, tasks that actually goes onto the device and pushes some config. These tasks can be anything. These tasks can be using the Ansible to push configuration onto devices. These tasks can be configuring loopback interface onto the router. These tasks can be fetching out the serial number of that router. These tasks can be fetching out versions of the router. These tasks can also be of configuring routing domains onto the router, or anything else. So this way Ansible basically can be used very, very easily in order to push configurations, in order to fetch out configurations, and in order to deploy infrastructure configurations on multiple devices in one go. You don't really need to write a Python script for that, but then Python script comes into play into advanced way where you need to use Python script to trigger an Ansible playbook upon a certain instant. For example, when you study for DevNet professional certifications, you learn about something about CI/CD pipeline. In this CI/CD pipeline, there will be instances. So normally, let's say whenever a team is working towards developing network infrastructure and there is a new set of IP addresses that needs to be configured onto certain interfaces, then your network engineer will go onto the routers and he or she will be doing those changes by taking CLI of the device. But into automative way, there are workflows which are built up. So in modern ways or in an automation way, the network engineer do not really need to go onto the device. The network engineer just need to log into its chat application or Teams application or Slack, or by using ticketing systems like Jira. The network engineer needs to create a ticket that he or she wants to add or configure IP addresses. The ticket will take parameters like what IP address needs to be configured on what interface, and based on that, the Jira ticket will be initiating a Git change repository, and the repository will be updated with the new information, and upon making a change into the repository, it will trigger a task, and that trigger will call an Ansible playbook. That Ansible playbook will go onto the devices and push configurations which have been suggested by the network engineer into the Jira ticket. So this way, there are automative workflows which are being developed nowadays in the industry, which goes out onto the device and pushes configurations or fetches out configuration upon a certain instant or upon a certain event. This is what we call as automation. And generally, in order to learn such kind of automation, you must be familiar with some of the network automation protocols or some of the network automation tools, which are these and these. So these tools specifically focuses on advanced devices like iOS XE, like I said, iOS XR and NX devices, and these tools focuses generically on every sort of device that are there. And that's exactly what we had to talk about into this particular webinar, to make you familiar about how we use these things and how we basically get familiar with all of these particular tools. You can go ahead and ask your questions for another couple of 5 minutes or so. I'll be staying here into the session, and for getting more information about it, you can basically jump up and you can go through our website at PyNet Labs Private Limited, where there are specific courses which we have launched that covers Python plus Ansible plus DevNet certification. When you are starting your journey with network automation, this is the best course and best training that you can get, which actually gives you a brief about Python's fundamentals. So if you're a network engineer and you want to start learning about network automation but have no idea about network automation, this is the course that you can pick, which basically makes you familiar with Python's fundamentals from scratch. Then we talk about network automation basics. Then we talk about how things like GitHub, how things like programming Python function, how things like CISCO supported APIs and automation protocols, how things like configuring iOS devices by using SSH, by using Telnet, using REST APIs, using model driven programmability by using Yang and so can be done, right? And various other things with introduction to Ansible, software requirements for Ansible, understanding the architecture and file structure of Ansible, and comparing Ansible with other protocols and working with playbooks and tasks into Ansible. All of these particular labs gets covered into this, which prepares you for your DevNet Associate exam. Then apart from that, it also gives you insight to programming basics and all. By using this particular portal, you will also get to know that what all are my upcoming trainings, okay, where we cater all of these particular network automation skills. And if you need more details or demo videos about our classes, you can get in touch with the phone number or the WhatsApp link that is available onto our portal. That will give you more brief about how we can use about it and how you can get started with your network automation career. If you have any question, please go ahead and ask. I'm looking at the chat. Someone is saying that which one is needed for network automation, Python or Ansible? Well, I think you're talking about data structuring languages. So XML, JSON and YAML, all three data structuring languages must be familiar for a candidate who is stepping up into network automation journey. Then Hussein is saying, does Python also used for Ansible? Yeah, you can say Python on the backend uses the Ansible, and when we use that, you don't really need to write down a Python script to trigger an Ansible task. Ansible task can be independently executed, but you can say that Python needs to be installed onto the machine, then only Ansible can be installed. So Python is used on the backend by Ansible, not in the front end by the user. I think we're good. So that's exactly what we had to talk about in this webinar, to make you guys familiar with what are networking tools, what are networking protocols which are there, along with some of the cutting edge technologies. And if you feel like having more discussions or more details about it, don't forget to go onto our website and get in touch with our team. They will help you with your queries a lot. Thank you so much for joining this webinar, and looking forward to see you again in some other webinar of mine. Thanks for joining. Have a good time ahead. Peace out.